Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We're on Tuesday this week because we just had a 4-day weekend here in the U.S., the Memorial Day weekend, and a historically bad weekend for the box office. There's no two ways about it. We have a lot of stuff to break down from these past few days. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk about something really exciting. I got the chance this week, actually, it was sort of a late development, to do my first live appearance of any kind, really, since I started the channel. It's something I always love to do. I love to play in the Schmodown. I loved when we did these sort of things with Screen Junkies when we go to different conventions. So in a little under a month, I'm going to be joining my good friend Christian Harloff on stage live in New York City. We're going to talk about movies, the box office. We're going to take your questions. It's Friday, June 21st at a venue in New York City right around Times Square called the Green Room 42. Tickets don't go on sale until later this week. That whole thing is still getting set up, but I wanted to mention it today so that you can mark your calendars. I'd love to see you there. And yeah, it's just kind of an experiment for me. I've never really done anything like this solo, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So Friday, June 21st, the Green Room 42 in New York City. Mark your calendar if you want to be there. And of course, as tickets go on sale, I will share that link and all that info. So I hope to see a lot of you in New York City in just a few weeks. So transitioning from that, let's look now at the box office. It sounds like maybe more people might show up to this thing in New York than went to the movies this past weekend, because it was not a great Memorial Day weekend for really any movie at the box office. And let's look at the box office top 5. These are the 3-day weekend numbers, and these are the latest estimates. Right now, it looks like Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, was able to squeak out a win over the 3-day weekend at $26.3 million versus the Garfield movie's $24 million. Now, these are estimates that are generated by the studios, and if you watch this show, you'll know that usually the estimates are within a few hundred or even a couple $100,000. There's usually not a whole lot of variance with the estimates. However, when the race is this close, sometimes the studios like to employ a little bit of gamesmanship and maybe overestimate their numbers. I think for the 3-day weekend especially, a $2+ million gap is a pretty hard thing to credibly overestimate. So I think that this is going to hold for Furiosa over the 3-day weekend, but it is a very close box office race between Garfield and Furiosa. But not a result that I think either movie wanted. Garfield's in a little bit better shape budget-wise. It was around $60 million reportedly, which is a lot less than Furiosa, but this was just a depressing result for Memorial Day weekend, and we will look at how historically bad it was in just a few minutes. Coming in third for the 3-day weekend was If, which dropped 52.2% for a $16.1 million 3-day weekend. Again, this is Friday through Sunday. $58.6 million running total for If through the 3 days. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes was in fourth place with $13.4 million, another good hold, a 47.3% drop. And then The Fall Guy, also another pretty good hold, in its fourth week, a 28.3% drop at $5.9 million. Now, these numbers are a little closer. This is the 4-day holiday, so this is Friday through Monday, and Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, still holds the edge right now at $32 million. The Garfield movie with an estimated $31.1 million. Again, this could flip, but with about $1 million in between, it would be pretty tough for Warner Brothers to justify why they overestimated that much. Of course, if there are any big changes, I will address it on the show next week. You may have noticed that I moved the corrections to later in the show. I got the feedback loud and clear that you didn't want them up top, so they are a little bit later, and they're pretty minor adjustments, and any major adjustments will go into those corrections and adjustments, and any major corrections will also go into the adjustments that I do. Once again, I just ask for a little bit of patience as I work with the scheduling of the show and try to find a new audience and try to find some people that might not have seen us before. But yes, feedback heard loud and clear regarding the revisions and adjustments. Those will be later on in the show. The positioning for all the other movies doesn't really change at all. If comes in at $21 million over the 4-day holiday for a $63.5 million running total. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is at $17.2 million. Its domestic total is now over $125 million. The Fall Guys at $7.6 million for the 4-day weekend for a domestic total of $73.9 million. So I mentioned that this was an historically bad Memorial Day weekend. Really, the only bit of good news for either Furiosa or Garfield is that they don't fall onto this chart. So these are the lowest grossing #1 Memorial Day movies from 1980, which is really when record keeping began weekend to weekend on the box office, to today. And when you don't adjust for inflation, 2024 doesn't show up on this list. So the lowest grossing Memorial Day #1 movie in that time period is a Richard Pryor comedy called Bustin' Loose from back in 1981, which made $4.7 million. In second place is The Empire Strikes Back, which might surprise people back in 1980 at $6.4 million. But keep in mind, there was a concerted effort to open The Empire Strikes Back in a small number of theaters on opening weekend because they wanted to get buzz going. They wanted to have this big demand. They wanted there to be big lines. And so it's really not surprising that it opened low because that was the strategy going in. In third place was Sylvester Stallone's film Cobra from 1986 at $15.6 million, the first of many Stallone movies on this list. In fourth place was Backdraft at $15.7 million back in 1991, followed by Rocky III in 1982, and then another Stallone film, Cliffhanger, in 1993 at just over $20 million. Then we have Casper in 1995 at $22 million, and the gross for Furiosa at $32 million this past weekend was the lowest grossing #1 Memorial Day film since Casper back in 1995. That just goes to show you how rough it is out there right now. In eighth place was Back to the Future Part 3 in 1990 at $23.7 million. Then Crocodile Dundee 2 from 1988 at $24.4 million, and Rambo First Blood Part 2 in 1985 at $25.1 million. And I'm sure the studios would prefer that I don't adjust for inflation because it keeps their movie from 2024 off the list, but you know the show and you know what I do. Of course I'm going to adjust for inflation. So these are the lowest grossing #1 Memorial Day movies from 1980 to 2024 when you adjust for inflation, and this is going to hurt. At #1 is still Bustin' Loose at $16.5 million, followed by The Empire Strikes Back at $24.4 million. It was only in about 125 theaters. And then we have Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, at $32 million, adjusted for inflation, the third worst Memorial Day gross for any movie from 1980 to 2024, at least a movie that had that #1 spot. Backdraft is in fourth place. Cliffhanger is in fifth place, but I mean, the grosses go up pretty high from here. Cobra's in sixth place at $44.7 million. Casper adjusts up to $45.4 million. Rocky III goes up to over $50 million. Tomorrowland from 2015 jumps onto this list at $56.4 million. And Back to the Future Part 3 back in 1990 is at number 10 at $56.8 million. And Tomorrowland, I think, is a good indicator as to how the discussions have changed around the box office, because I remember when that movie came out at $56.4 million, everybody was talking about, oh my God, what a disaster that movie is. And here it made almost twice as much as Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, which is part of a franchise. You would think that it would have opened bigger. I think everybody thought that it was going to open even bigger than this, even if it wasn't going to be a huge hit. $32 million. Honestly, I thought that Garfield was going to open a lot bigger, but people just didn't show up. And there is a lot of discussion going on about why this is happening. And some people are saying, well, you know, if people are watching it at home, then it doesn't really matter to the studios because they're just making their money another way, which is true, but that doesn't help the exhibition industry. That doesn't help them at all. And so this was a bad weekend, especially for theater owners, because the audience wasn't really there for either the R-rated action movie or the kids movie. Looking at the Mad Max franchise, these are the domestic final grosses. We actually don't have opening weekend grosses for all of the films, particularly the original Mad Max. Mad Max Fury Road, not surprisingly, has the highest domestic gross in the franchise at $153.6 million back in 2015. Then we have Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome in second place at $36.2 million. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, is going to surpass that very soon, maybe today or tomorrow, because it's currently at $31 million estimated. Then we have The Road Warrior at $23.6 million. That's what Mad Max 2 was released as here in the United States. And then the original Mad Max at $8.7 million. When you adjust those franchise numbers for inflation, Mad Max Fury Road comes out on top still at $203.2 million. Then we have Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome at $105.5 million, The Road Warrior at $76.9 million, the original Mad Max at $33.2 million, and then Furiosa, a Mad Max saga at $31 million. And if the bottom falls out of Furiosa, we'll have to see what happens in these next couple of weeks, and it doesn't hit that $100 million mark, then it could very easily fall short of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome when you adjust for inflation, which isn't exactly known as a huge box office success. The Garfield movie shouldn't be overlooked. It ran a close second, and depending on whether WB was really playing fast and loose with those estimates, could technically flip to first for the 4-day weekend. Kung Fu Panda 4, though, still has the highest animated film opening of 2024 at $57.9 million. The Garfield movie did less than half of that at $24 million over its opening 3-day weekend. Demon Slayer 2: The Hashira Training has the third best animated opening of the year at $11.5 million, followed by Spy Family Code White at $4.8 million, and the 20th anniversary re-release of Shrek 2 at $1.4 million. The studio saved most of their big animated films for the summer movie season. I don't want to overlook If either, because as I mentioned last week, you had the opening weekend and then we have the box office run in total. And if it can hold up, then it could be a movie that's able to eke out at least a decent amount of profitability. And when we look at the original IP grosses for 2024, these are movies that aren't based on anything pre-existing, a person's life, a book, whatever. Civil War is at number 1 at $68 million. The Beekeepers at number 2 at $66.2 million. But If will soon pass both of them to become the highest grossing film this year to be original intellectual property. Challengers is in 4th place at $46.8 million, and Argyle is in 5th at $45.2 million. And then just to update you on the Planet of the Apes franchise, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is currently about $20 million behind War for the Planet of the Apes for 4th all-time on the domestic box office gross list. When you adjust those numbers for inflation, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is now less than $15 million behind Beneath the Planet of the Apes, the first Ape sequel back in 1970, for number 6 on the list, and it's still got a lot of work to do, about $60 million if it wants to catch War for the Planet of the Apes and crack that top 5. Let's look at numbers 6 through 10 for this past weekend. At number 6 was The Strangers Chapter 1, which dropped 53%. Not a bad drop for a horror movie. It brought in $5.5 million over the 3-day weekend for a $21.2 million total. The newest film from Angel Studios comes in 7th place. It was called Sight and brought in $2.7 million. Then we have Challengers in 8th place at $1.4 million. Back to Black with a hefty drop in 9th place, a 61.9% drop from last weekend, and just over $1 million. And then we have Babes, which opened in extremely limited release last weekend. It's still in limited release, but it got its weekend gross up to over $1 million, which is good enough for number 10. It's possible that Back to Black and Babes could switch. As you can see, they're pretty close as far as their weekend grosses. Looking at the 4-day estimated numbers for May 24th through 27th, The Strangers Chapter 1 goes up to $6.9 million. Sight goes up to $3.5. Challengers goes up to $1.7 million. Back to Black's at $1.3 million, and Babes is at $1.2 million. So Back to Black opening a little bit more of a lead according to the estimated numbers over the 4-day holiday. Dropping out of the top 10 this week, we have Godzilla Kong: The New Empire after 8 weeks. Civil War does actually drop out after 6 weeks. It was able to sneak back into the top 10 when actual numbers came in last week. Tarot drops out after 3 weeks, and then The Blue Angels, which was always a sort of special event cinema type thing, drops out after just 1 week. And when we look at the movies that had the longest run in the top 10 this year, Kung Fu Panda's at number 1 at 10 weeks. We had Dune Part 2 in second with 9 weeks. Then The Beekeeper and Godzilla Kong: The New Empire basically tie for third. They were each in the top 10 for 8 weeks. And Ghostbusters Frozen Empire rounds out the top 5 at 7 weeks. I think I unintentionally knocked 1 week off of Frozen Empire last week, so this is a corrected chart. Looking at what I like to call the road to recovery, the blue line are the box office weekend averages for 2015 through 2019. The red line would be the box office weekend averages for 2021 to 2023. And then the dotted black line are our weekend totals for this year. And you can see that we were well below where we've been on average, not just pre-pandemic, but since theaters opened. The highest grossing film in the 2021 to 2023 window was actually the highest opening film ever over Memorial Day, Top Gun: Maverick. It's weird weird when you look at the record books. 2022, 2023, we have Top Gun: Maverick, The Little Mermaid, two of the 5 best Memorial Day grosses of all time. This year, one of the worst Memorial Day grosses of all time. The highest grossing film before that window from 2015 through 2019 was the opening of Disney's Aladdin back in 2019, which made over $90 million. When we look at the biggest theater count changes for this past weekend, Taro dropped 1,470 theaters. It's now out of wide release in 864 theaters total. Unsung Hero dropped just over 1,200 theaters. It's also out of wide release at 527 theaters total. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire also dropped out of wide release. It lost 1,109 theaters. It's now in 664. Kung Fu Panda 4 dropping out of wide release. There's a trend here. It loses 952 theaters for a 485 remaining theater count. And then The Fall Guy dropped 890 theaters, as it's also now available for people to watch at home. It's still in 2,955 theaters. So I want to talk a little bit about the current state of the box office, not just regarding Memorial Day, but as far as just where we are in the year so far. And something that we looked at last week was the number of days into the year that we've gotten for the past several years before a movie opens to $100 million or more. We started this chart last week, and we can see that we're still building that record. We don't have a $100 million opener yet. The year with the longest time before a $100 million opener, unsurprisingly, was 2021. 2020 is excluded from this chart because really there were no movies that played past the first couple months of the year. So there were 351 days that passed in 2021 until Spider-Man No Way Home opened to over $100 million. Then we have 2011, 196 days pass before Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 opened to over 100 million. 2014 with 178 days until Transformers Age of Extinction opened to over $100 million. And then we have this year, the 4th longest streak since 2010, 148 days and counting with no $100 million opener. And honestly, I don't know if we're going to get one until a couple months from now, when Deadpool and Wolverine opens, because Inside Out 2 tracking, the first tracking looks like it's going to be at around $80 to $85 million. Now, I don't put a whole lot of stock in tracking because I think that it's just way too broad and there are too many X factors and things to predict. But I don't think it's really too far-fetched to imagine that we do get to July 23rd before that $100 million opener, and we're probably number 2 on this list by then. There is always a chance that a movie could pop up, Inside Out 2 or Bad Boys or something that really overperforms, but it is looking like we could potentially be in still for a very long wait. And if you remember, when we adjust the numbers for inflation, we're already at the second longest gap. 2021 was down to 273 days because Venom: Let There Be Carnage technically goes up to $100 million opening when you adjust for inflation. So we're 148 days into the year without one of those openings. But there's also something that I saw some people ask about that I thought was interesting, which is, why don't we measure not just how many days into the year we got before a movie opened at over $100 million, but what have the longest gaps been between movies that opened to over $100 million? And I did the research, and it turns out that we have a handful of instances where there were gaps of 150 days or more. That was my cutoff, 150 days or more between $100 million openers. So let's look at those gaps. Again, this is since 2010. First of all, we had a gap from June 18th, 2010 to November 18th, 2010 between Toy Story 3 and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1. There was another gap between June 14th, 2013 and November 22nd, 2013 between Man of Steel and The Hunger Games: Catching Fire. In 2012, we had a gap from November 16th to May 3rd, 2013 between Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2 and Iron Man 3. That was a 168-day gap. There was a 217-day gap between November 22nd, 2013, which was The Hunger Games: Catching Fire, and June 27th, 2014, which was Transformers Age of Extinction. There was a 239-day gap between the last two Harry Potter films, from November 18th, 2010 to July 15th, 2011. Then a 259-day gap between Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom in June 2018 and Captain Marvel in March 2019. Then we have the current gap. It's already the second longest since 2010, from July 21st of last year when Barbie opened until right now. It's 312 days, so almost a full year. And then, of course, the longest gap since 2010, this really shouldn't be surprising, is from December 20th, 2019 to December 12th, 2021. That was the time between Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker and Spider-Man: No Way Home, and that pretty much encompasses the entire length that theaters were closed, 727 days, almost 2 full years. So that's already a pretty bad statistic, that we're at the second longest gap between $100 million openers since 2010, but it gets even worse when you adjust for inflation. This is what the inflation-adjusted chart looks like. We only have 4 instances where there were 150 days or more between $100 million openings. We have a 153-day gap between Toy Story 3 and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1. We have a 162-day gap between Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and Fast 5, which is one of those openings that does go up when you adjust for inflation. And then we have the current gap, 312 days between Barbie and whatever opens next. That gap is just going to get bigger. And then finally, of course, we have the big gap that encompasses the pandemic theater closures from December 20th, 2019. Although that gap does get smaller, it's 651 days because it goes from The Rise of Skywalker to Venom: Let There Be Carnage. But we will be, I think, well over half of that distance by the time we get that next $100 million opener. And that's with all theaters open. That's with a fairly full release schedule, although the strike really didn't help things. But still, we're certainly not even where we were in 2021. We don't have a gap at any point when you look at theaters reopening from 2021 to 2022. It doesn't exist, even with fewer movies and a theatrical industry that was far less robust than we should be having right now. So this is pretty perilous times. This is a pretty dire time, especially, as I mentioned, for the exhibition industry. We looked at this, I think, about a month ago. This is the cumulative domestic box office for 2024 this year. So this is January through May from the years 2015 through 2024. And you can see that we're around $2.5-ish billion as far as total box office. That number changes depending on where you source it. But we are just under $1 billion behind where we were this time last year, and we're about $250 million behind where we were in 2022 when not much even came out during the first part of the year. Of course, 2021 was the slowest year because almost nothing came out. It was only at $646 million cumulatively through May, and then $1.7 billion in 2020 because everything shut down essentially in March and April. And you can see that we're at half, really less than half of where we were pre-pandemic. So adding really to the dire picture is the fact that we're not just slowly rebuilding or recovering, we are regressing majorly from where we were. Yes, the strikes have something to do with it, but that's not the whole story here. I think a lot of the reason is that consumer behavior is changing, and I think a lot of the reason is honestly that the movies may not just be the kind of things that people want to rush out and see. I know a lot of people love Furiosa. I thought that it was pretty good, but it wasn't something that I was like, oh my God, this is a masterpiece. Really, Dune Part 2 is really one of the only movies I've seen this year where I thought, wow, people really have to run out and see this in theaters. Not to say that you shouldn't see Furiosa and other movies like that in theaters, but I think the product is part of the problem. This is something we'll be updating around the end of every month. This is the box office market share for 2024 as far as all movie tickets sold year to date. This is what it looked like as we started the summer movie season at the end of April. And let's see where we are right now. And really the big change is that Disney was able to get some market share. It had about 2.7% at the end of April due to Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes coming out. It now has about 7.7%. Warner Brothers has lost about 4% market share because they're giving ground to Disney. Universal's is just about the same. Sony's market share is just about the same as well. Paramount has picked up a little bit. Disney's picked up about 5% market share. Lionsgate share is about the same as is Amazon's. Really, the All Others tab is the only one that lost percentage market share. Those are your A24s, the studios that aren't the major studios. But still, they've got about 12% market share for the year so far, which isn't too bad. We've got a lot more numbers to break down, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. This episode's brought to you by Mando. You've probably heard of Lumi whole body deodorant for women, But did you know that there's now a version for men? It's called Mando, and it uses the same clinically proven formula, but with cologne quality scents for men. Mando whole body deodorant is made with mandelic acid, which blocks the sweat-eating bacteria on your skin from causing odor. I'm a personal fan of the bourbon leather scent, which I have in a deodorant and a body wash for the shower. And it's great to know that as I sweat, I don't have to worry about whether or not I still smell good. I work weird hours, so sometimes I'll throw on some Mando in the morning and pull an all-nighter, but it doesn't matter because I'm still fresh the next morning and can make that Starbucks run before I jump back in the shower. And Mando is a whole body deodorant, meaning it's safe to use anywhere, and I mean anywhere on your body that you want to keep smelling great. Mando's starter pack is perfect for Father's Day. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice like a mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. Give the man in your life the gift of aluminum-free whole body deodorant. New customers get $5 off a starter pack with our exclusive code that equates to over 40% off your starter pack. Shop Mando's Father's Day bundle with code DAN at shopmando.com. That's shopmando.com. This episode is brought to you by Miracle Made. Memorial Day has officially marked the beginning of summer, which also means warmer temperatures. And if you're a hot sleeper like me, that can also mean some sweaty nights adjusting to the heat. But with Miracle Made sheets, you don't have to worry about that because their silver-infused fabrics inspired by NASA are temperature regulating, so you can get that all-important good night's sleep without waking up drenched in sweat. You're also not sacrificing comfort for a comfortable temperature because Miracle Made sheets are incredibly soft, as good as you'll get at some of the best hotels in the world. And you don't have to worry about washing the sheets constantly to stay cool because Miracle Made sheets also prevent 99.7% of bacterial growth, keeping them fresh 3 times longer than other sheets. Go to trymiracle.com/Dan to try Miracle Made sheets today, and whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code Dan at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle's so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/Dan and use the code Dan to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/Dan to treat yourself. Thanks to Miracle Made for sponsoring this episode. All right, so as promised, let's look at a couple of revisions and corrections from last week's show, and really the major one concerns the top 10. I mentioned that Civil War did end up hanging on to that top 10 spot. It was number 10 when we look at our revised figures at just over $1 million. So it did spend a 6th week in the top 10. The rankings and the positioning of all of the other movies stayed the same in the top 10. This did change the dropouts for last week as well. So Unsung Hero is the movie that dropped out of the top 10 instead of Civil War. It dropped out after 4 weeks. The others were the same. Kung Fu Panda out after 10. And then the only other change really is that in the per theater average race, there was a movie that played in one theater called Taking Venice. It's a documentary about the U.S. effort during the Cold War in the 1960s to have an American artist win the Venice Biennale and fight communism with culture. So it ended up coming in 3rd place on the per theater average chart at just over $7,000, playing in just one theater. That bumped down Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes and the Blue Angels. But other than that, it stayed the same. And that's why I say the corrections and adjustments that I have to do on the show by moving it to Monday and using the estimates, I think are going to be pretty minimal. I know some people say that they don't see the function of the show or that it's way less accurate if I'm using estimates. And that's really just not the case, or at least not so far. Now, we could have a case maybe with Garfield and Furiosa this weekend. If one of them flip-flops, that's a pretty major change, but it's also something that I will talk about and correct in real time. I honestly think that 95% of the data or more that you're getting on the show is almost exactly the same as it would be if you waited for the actuals. I'm just kind of trying to experiment here and try a couple new things. Let's turn our eyes now to the international box office. These were the top 5 films in markets outside of the US and Canada. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, brings in $33.3 million. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes brings in $20.6 million. The Garfield movie, which has been open internationally for a few weeks now in some markets, brings in $14 million. If brought in $11.3 million over the weekend, and Twilight of the Warriors Walled In brought in $6.9 million. When you take those international numbers, you combine them with our our domestic gross, we get our top 5 films worldwide, and Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, is the number 1 film of the weekend worldwide at $58.8 million. It is not one of the 5 biggest debuts for a Hollywood film this year. That's why I'm not showing you that chart. The Garfield movie had a huge boost from last weekend due to its opening in the domestic marketplace and a few others, a 276% increase in business for $38.7 million. Then we had Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which drops 48.6%, but adds another $33.9 million. If brings in another $27.4 million worldwide with a 50.2% drop, and then The Fall Guy drops 36.2% and brings in another $9.9 million. Let's look at the summer movie season domestically so far. This is the summer box office chart. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes remains number 1, followed by The Fall Guy in second place. If in third place, Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, enters the charts at number 4. The Garfield movie enters the chart at number 5. The Strangers Chapter 1 stays right where it was last week at number 6. Tarot drops 3 spots down to number 7. The re-release of Star Wars Episode 1 also drops down 3 spots to number 8. Back in Black drops 2 spots to number 9. And Sight enters the top 10 list. Not Another Church Movie, which was not a successful film but did have a wide release and thus was on the chart for a couple of weeks, has had its dreams of being a top 10 summer movie dashed because it is now officially out of the top 10. Let's take a look at my predictions to see how they're holding up so far. 2 of the movies that I predicted to be top 10 summer movies just opened. I predicted Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, to be the 6th highest grossing film of the summer, and I predicted Garfield to be the 8th highest grossing movie of the summer. So they're highlighted there in yellow because I picked them to be on my list, but they are not currently in the correct placement. The next movie that I picked to be a top 10 summer movie is Bad Boys Ride or Die, which opens in a couple weeks on June 7th. And judging by the summer so far, I thought when I picked my movies that I might be picking the winners that got beat out by some of the other movies. But I think really it's going to be which movies disappointed the least this summer, because I think there's going to be some films like maybe even The Fall Guy that were box office disappointments to some extent, but might hang around in the top 10 just because nothing else is going to succeed to that level. I thought this was already going to be an interesting summer at the box office. I think it gets even more interesting as far as the top 10 due to how bad things have been so far. So this is going to be one of those summers that's just super weird. I don't know how many of these things I'm going to get right. And you know what? I guess I'll take an interesting summer to cover over a boring one. I just wish it didn't mean that so many movies were not performing well. These are some of these specialty charts, and we'll start with the per theater averages for Friday through Sunday. At number 1 is a movie called Kidnapped, the abduction of Edgardo Mortara, which brought in $7,013 per theater in just 2 theaters. It's about a young Jewish boy who was taken from his home and raised by the Catholic Church. In second place was Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, which brought in $6,913 per theater in 3,804 theaters. In third place was the Garfield movie, which brought in $5,954 per theater in 4,035 theaters. And one interesting thing to note, according to box office reporting that I read, more people actually went to see Garfield over the Memorial Day weekend, but the reason that Furiosa has the box office edge is because it leaned more towards those premium ticket prices, the HDXs and IMAXs and all that stuff. So that's why it actually made more, even though more people reportedly went to see Garfield. In fourth place was If, which brought in $3,963 in each of its over 4,000 theaters. And then we have Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which brought in $3,774 in each of its 3,550 theaters. Looking at the films in limited release, these are movies in 1,000 theaters or fewer. At number 1 was Babes, which had a big expansion to 590 theaters, hence its big jump in gross to over $1 million. I Saw the TV Glow is in 458 theaters and brought in just over $500,000 in its 4th week of release. Evil Does Not Exist brought in over $100,000 in 138 theaters. Then we have Wildcat, which brought in about $80,000 in 94 theaters, and Escape from Germany, which brought in around $74,000 in 49 theaters. This is the annual domestic box office for 2024. These are movies released this year. Dune Part 2 remains the #1 movie of the year and also has officially ended its domestic box office run at $282.1 million. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire is in second place at $195.6 million. Then we have Kung Fu Panda 4 in third place at $193.3 million. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes climbs up to number 4 at $126.6 million, followed by Ghostbusters Frozen Empire dropping down to number 5 at $112.7 million. Bob Marley One Love stays at number 6. The Fall Guy jumps up to number 7. Mean Girls drops down to number 8. Civil War drops down to number 9. And The Beekeeper drops to number 10, although If is sniffing that number 10 spot, so The Beekeeper will likely be out of the top 10 next week. This is the 2024 worldwide box office. Dune Part 2 remains the highest grossing film of the year so far worldwide at $711.8 million, followed by Godzilla Kong: The New Empire at $566.9 million. It is getting very, very close to overtaking Kong Skull Island to be the highest grossing MonsterVerse film worldwide. I'll update that when and if that changes. Kung Fu Panda 4 is at number 3 at $541.7 million. Then we have YOLO, Pegasus 2, and Article 20 from China at numbers 4, 5, and 6. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes moves up to number 7 at $298.6 million. That moves Boonie Bears Time Twist down to number 8. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire crosses the $200 million worldwide mark at number 9. And Bob Marley One Love remains at number 10. Looking at the worldwide box office for the last year, so from last May 28th to this May 28th, we have a change because The Little Mermaid has officially rotated off this list. It stayed on it for one full year. That means that Barbie's at number 1, Oppenheimer's at number 2, Dune Part 2's at number 3, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is at number 4, but only for one more week because it rotates out after this weekend. Wonka's at number 5, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 moves up and takes The Little Mermaid's spot at number 6. Godzilla Kong moves up to number 7. Kung Fu Panda actually jumps over No More Bets to become the 8th highest grossing film over the past year. No More Bets stays at number 9, and then another Chinese film, Lost in the Stars, gets added to the chart by virtue of being bumped up as the next highest grossing film over this one-year window. Before we go, as always, I like to look at a weekend in box office history, and I mentioned that this was the lowest grossing number 1 opener since Casper back in 1995, so let's look at that Memorial Day weekend in 1995, where Casper was the number 1 film over the 4-day weekend at just over $22 million. It legged out, though. It ended up at over $100.4 million. In second place was Die Hard with a Vengeance in its second week of release, which brought in just over $19 million. Some real competition for that number 1 spot. It had a running total at that point of $48.9 million and ended up at just over $100 million, almost an identical gross actually to Casper. This might surprise some people. Braveheart was in third place. It opened in third at $12.9 million, got a little bit of a jump on the holiday box office by opening on Wednesday, but even still, its total to that point was $15.5 million. It ended up at $75.6 million domestic, but it was one of those rare movies that stayed alive for over half the year and wound up winning the Best Picture Academy Award. In fourth place was Crimson Tide in its third week of release at $12.8 million for a running total of $53.9 million and a domestic total of $91.3 million. And man, if you liked action-type movies in 1995, on Memorial Day weekend, you could have done a triple header of Die Hard with a Vengeance, Braveheart, and Crimson Tide. That's not too shabby. In fifth place was Forget Paris, starring Billy Crystal and Deborah Winger at $7.7 million. Its domestic final ended up around $33.1 million. But of course, because this was nearly 30 years ago, you know what we like to do here on the show. We like to adjust for inflation and see what that Memorial Day weekend would look like in today's dollars. And when we hit that button, we see that Casper opened to an adjusted total of $45.4 million, so far ahead of where Furiosa and every other movie was this weekend. Its final gross was $206.6 million adjusted. Die Hard with a Vengeance comes in second at $39.1 million and a $205.7 million final adjusted gross. Braveheart comes in third at $26.5 million, so right around where we saw our number one movie this past weekend. Its final domestic adjusted total was $155.5 million. Then we have Crimson Tide at $26.3 million, a very close race between 3 and 4 there, for a final domestic total of $188 million. And Forget Paris at an adjusted total of $15.8 million for its second weekend, and a final domestic adjusted total of $68.2 million. Well, if Hollywood was looking for a big rebound this weekend, they're not going to get it because there are no major releases from studios this week. I guess they just thought that they would bask in the afterglow of Furiosa and Garfield, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. However, there are a lot of films that will be hitting many markets nationwide, including mine. I kind of use this as the litmus test for how deeply some of these movies are going to get into their release window and where they're going to play around the country. First of all, The Crow is having a 30th anniversary re-release ahead of the reboot, which comes out later this year. That will play tomorrow night and Thursday night in many theaters around the country. And then this weekend, there are several movies that are going to be opening in many markets, including In a Violent Nature, about a vengeful spirit that hacks and slashes its way to revenge after being wronged from beyond the grave. Ezra will also be opening in many theaters nationwide. It's about a man raising his autistic son and stars Bobby Cannavale, Robert De Niro, and Rose Byrne. Also, the girls are getting back together at summer camp. Kathy Bates, Diane Keaton, and Alfre Woodard are childhood friends who reunite at a summer camp reunion. I think Diane Keaton is required to be sent every script for this kind of movie. And then finally, Haikyuu, The Dumpster Battle, the first movie adaptation of the anime series, which was adapted from the manga, will be hitting many theaters nationwide. This is already, I believe, the second highest grossing film in Japan this year. And that's it for Charts with Dan this week. Kind of a downbeat week for box office news, but maybe we'll have some better weeks ahead. As always, let me know down in the comments below what you think about this news and suggestions that you might have for the show. I do read the comments and I take a lot of them in, so even if they are things that I should be doing better or that you think I'm doing wrong, I still do read your comments and suggestions. Thank you so much to the sponsors for this week's show. You can check out their links in the description below. Don't forget about that show coming up June 21st in New York City. I'll have more information about that, including how to buy tickets in the next days. And stay tuned right here for more movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.